This week on Scripturology.
Believe God's Word. When you come out of God's woodshed, you will come out changed. You will not be the same person coming out that you were going in if you learned your lesson and are thankful for it instead of whining that it was unfair. I have got to be out of my mind trying to teach Exodus 2 and 3 in the same lesson because we could easily make 4 lessons out of the material. But we're going to try to keep this study just under 20 weeks, so we're just going to have to jump right into it. In chapter 1 of Exodus, we saw that Pharaoh had gotten nervous about the number of Hebrew people living in Egypt. He thought enslaving them would stifle their growth. But that didn't work. So next he instructed the Hebrew midwives to kill the newborn boys upon delivery. That didn't work either. Finally, Pharaoh flat out commanded that all infant sons be thrown into the Nile River. Now that might work, but we don't know what comes of it. As chapter 2 begins, the scene drills down to focus on one Hebrew household, that of a Levite couple. From Numbers chapter 26 verse 59, we know that the names of this couple were Amram and Jochebed. Now this couple already had a daughter and a son before the edict was issued that future sons be discarded in the Nile. But a third child was born to them after the edict, and it was a beautiful bouncing baby boy. Jochebed concealed the infant boy's existence for 3 months, but that's all she could manage. As that baby boy grew, no doubt the volume of his cries grew too. So Jochebed threw him in the Nile. Well, not quite. She put him in a basket that she took care to waterproof with tar. And then she placed that basket among the reeds in the river so it wouldn't float away downstream. The baby's older sister stationed herself close by to see what would happen to him. What happened is that this baby won the social lottery. The daughter of Pharaoh himself happened to come to the river to take a bath. Now, you'd think that Pharaoh's daughter wouldn't have to bathe with the risk of crocodiles, wouldn't you? Like, didn't she have a private pool or at least a tub? These are the kinds of questions that women bring up in Bible study, right? We think about these things. For whatever reason, the princess has to bathe in the river, and she sees a basket among the reeds. Well, women are also curious. The princess sent a servant to get that basket, and she discovered a squalling baby inside. Verse 6 of chapter 2 says that she took pity on him. The verse also says that she identified the child as one of the Hebrews' children. Now, it could have been a few things that tipped her off that this was a Hebrew child. Could have been that the Hebrews were fair and Egyptians were darker, so his appearance was different. Could have been that this baby boy had been circumcised, or it could have been that no one but a Hebrew would put their baby boy in a basket in the river. Well, just at that moment, the baby's big sister, who we find out later is named Miriam, big sister inserts herself into the drama. She boldly approaches the princess and asks if she needs a Hebrew woman to nurse this child for her. I think this little girl was thinking. She was sharp and quick. When the princess tells her to go find someone, who does she bring back to the river? Jochebed. Pharaoh's daughter tells her, Jochebed, to take the child until he is weaned. Okay, that's going to be about 3 years. And she tells Jochebed that she will pay her wages for her service. We're going to see that time zooms by from verse to verse. The next thing we know, in verse 10, Jochebed is bringing the young boy back to Pharaoh's daughter, and she adopts him. She gives him the name Moses because she says she drew him out of the water. It's interesting that she gives the baby a Hebrew name, but actually the name was also similar to the Egyptian word Mos, which means son. Okay, there were pharaohs in Egyptian history who were named Amos and Thutmose. Well, isn't it amazing to see how everything came together for this child? The river that was supposed to drown him instead became his vehicle of blessing. He was saved by the daughter of the king who had condemned him to die. And he was nursed and cared for by the one woman who loved him most in the world, his own mother. And she was paid for the privilege. Finally, he had been born into a family of slaves, but was adopted into the most affluent and influential family in the land. I mean, you can't do better than living in Pharaoh's household. One of the commentaries I read studying for this lesson said that it was customary for the child princes of other nations to be sent to be educated in the household of the Pharaoh of Egypt, because there they would receive the best education that the world had to offer at the time. So Moses would have benefited from this privilege, receiving training in such subjects as linguistics, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture, music and medicine, law and diplomacy. Moses was trained to be the leader of an opposing nation by Pharaoh himself. Well, if Moses had won the social lottery, it seems like that lottery was rigged. And it was. And God was at work in every detail of Moses' young life. Nothing was by chance. God was preparing a great leader for his people. But Moses blew it. Let's read what happens in Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 22. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that way, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" And he answered, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Okay, baby Moses is all grown up now. Didn't I say that time flies between verses? In Acts chapter 7, verse 23, Stephen says that Moses is 40 years old at this time. Verse 11 in our text says that he went out to his people and he looked on their burdens. Now, even though Moses had been reared and educated as an Egyptian, he maintained his Hebrew identity in his heart. When he looked on an Egyptian beating another Hebrew, Verse 11 says Moses saw that Hebrew as one of his own people. The text doesn't indicate that Moses considered using any of the diplomatic skills he had been educated in Pharaoh's household. He just takes the side of this Hebrew and he kills the Egyptian. Now, down through the history of Christendom, there have been many commentators who have tried to justify Moses' action. You know, wouldn't it be fun to see one of those legal drama programs on television reenact this scene and try to build a defense case for Moses? Now, they might say that when Moses looked this way and looked that, he wasn't looking to hide what he was going to do to the Egyptian, but he was simply looking to see if there was anyone else around who would help this Hebrew. Or maybe they could point out that Moses, as a prince of Egypt, was within his rights to enforce the ancient legal principle of lex talionis. Now, lex talionis is the law of retaliation, or what we would call an eye for an eye. You see, in the Hebrew, the word for what the Egyptian did to the Hebrew and the word for what Moses did to the Egyptian is the same word. The language there doesn't distinguish between beating someone and killing them. But you know, those defenses don't explain why Moses then hid the body of the Egyptian in the sand. That's not the kind of thing you do if you are acting within your rights. Well, apparently at least one other Hebrew saw what Moses had done, what had happened, and word got around. Now, wouldn't you think they'd all be grateful that Moses, son of Pharaoh's daughter, that he stood up for them? Well, they're not grateful at all. In fact, they're full of contempt. I don't know, maybe being a slave makes you grumpy, I don't know. But the word wasn't out only among the Hebrews. Pharaoh heard of it too, and he wanted that traitor Moses dead. I can just imagine the "I told you so" conversation that he had with his daughter, who had insisted on adopting that Hebrew baby boy against his decree that all the Hebrew baby boys be thrown into the Nile to drown. Well, Moses has to get out of Dodge, and he runs all the way to Midian, which is basically like really east, somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula, or maybe beyond that into modern Iran. I wanted to show you where it was on a map, but its location is disputed among several claims, so I can't really point to one place. And you know, that's also the case with Mount Horeb, which we're going to come to in the next chapter. There are lots of guesses about the locations of these places, but nothing definitive. So I don't have a map for you, just a direction, east. So the man God was preparing to lead the nation of Hebrews lands up in the wilderness of Midian working as a shepherd. His father-in-law, you know, put him to work. Now, if you were with us for our study of Genesis, you might remember we said that shepherds were considered detestable by the Egyptians. But that's how Joseph got his family settled in the best part of Egypt. His brothers told the Pharaoh at the time that they were shepherds. And so they were put in charge of Pharaoh's herds, but off in the fertile Goshen by themselves. So now Moses is a detestable shepherd too. He has fallen a long way as a result of his impulsive action of killing the Egyptian. It would seem like he has blown it and thrown his life away. Maybe you can relate to Moses. Maybe you've done something impulsively sinful, or maybe it was even planned. But the result was that it seemed that you had thrown your life away. I can relate. I've been there. But I want to tell you, if you repent of that sin and submit yourself to the discipline of God, God can work it to His glory and to your benefit. How do I know that? Well, from my own experience, for one thing, but that's not enough for us. So look at what the writer of Hebrews said. For they, speaking of our earthly fathers, disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. But He, speaking of God, disciplines us for our good, that we may share His holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Believe God's word. When you come out of God's woodshed, you will come out changed. You will not be the same person coming out that you were going in if you learned your lesson and are thankful for it instead of whining that it was unfair. Moses starts to change immediately. Did you notice when he came to the aid of the 7 sisters? He didn't kill the shepherds, but he only drove them away. And then he served those girls by watering their flocks for them. Now, men did not serve women in ancient times. And you know, Moses was raised with servants himself. But he is acting with humility. And that is a necessary trait if you are going to lead God's people. And speaking of God's people, the last 2 verses of chapter 2 tell us that they are beginning to cry out for deliverance. And God has heard them. We'll see what happens next, right after this brief break. I'm so glad you're watching today's program as we study the book of Exodus. Maybe this is the first time you've seen a scripturology program, or maybe you've been studying with us for a while. I want you to know that I have been, and continue to be, sitting in the student's chair myself. If there's one thing that can irritate me about a Bible study, it's when I feel like my time has been wasted. I consider it wasted if I don't learn something I didn't know before I invested my time with that teacher. That's the mindset I bring to teaching women on scripturology. Do not want to waste your time, and I hope that's evident in our lessons. If you're learning more about God and His Word and how to apply it, I'd ask you to tell a friend about our program. In this way, you can help us in our mission to make faithful disciples of Christ. We're going to pick up our lesson by reading Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 14. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. Jethro is an alternate name for Reuel, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of a land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, But I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Well, guess what's happened between the birth of Moses' son at the end of chapter 2 and God speaking to Moses in the burning bush here in chapter 3? A whole lot more time has passed. According again to Stephen in Acts chapter 7, another 40 years has passed. God is not in a hurry to get anyone into ministry. They have to be fully prepared. And God decides when our cake is ready to come out of the oven. Moses had 40 years to learn how to lead, feed, and care for a flock in the wilderness. This knowledge was going to be just as useful as everything that he had learned in Pharaoh's household school, because God was calling Moses to shepherd his people. God told Moses that he was going back to Pharaoh in order to secure the release of the children of Israel. Now, we didn't read the verse, but at the end of chapter 2, it says that the Pharaoh Moses had known, the one that he was raised in his household, that Pharaoh was dead, so he would be dealing with a new one when he went back to Egypt. Well, Moses has some questions about this assignment that he's being given. The first thing he wants to know is, who am I? Now, that's a legitimate question. Now, Moses wasn't questioning his identity in an existential sense, like, who am I? No, he was questioning his ability for the task that God was asking him to do. You see, the last time Moses had tried to liberate just a single Hebrew from the land of Egypt, that didn't go so well. Moses was pretty sure that he wasn't good at the sort of thing that he was being asked to do. And he was right. But God's response was that he would be with Moses. And God voluntarily offers Moses a sign. The sign would be that once Moses was successful, he would serve God in the same place where they were right then having that conversation. The success of Moses' mission was the sign. Moses would have to act in faith on God's word to receive that sign. Well, the second question Moses has after he asks, who am I, is to ask, who are you? Remember, Moses is hiding his face because he is afraid to look at God. So he's not being sassy in any way by asking that question. Moses realizes that his own name is not going to carry any kind of weight or credibility back in Egypt, and he needs some real authority to lean on. Now, if you want to know who someone is, what's the first thing you ask them? You ask their name. And God doesn't rebuke Moses for his question. Instead, he reveals his personal name, Yahweh, which means I am who I am. God is the only one who is just who he is. You know, this wasn't the first time that the personal covenant name of God had been revealed. It had been revealed earlier in Scripture, but apparently the Hebrew people had forgotten who that was. Now the name Yahweh, I am who I am, connotes that God is eternal. He is self-existent and he is unchangeable. And then God brings his identity closer to Moses and his people. He says that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Hebrews' ancestors and patriarchs, that apparently they would remember those names. As the chapter continues, God gives Moses some further instruction. He tells Moses the first thing to do in Egypt is to gather the elders of the Hebrew people and tell them that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has appeared to him and that he has seen what's happening to them in Egypt, and he's promising to bring them out of Egypt and into the land of Canaan that is flowing with milk and honey. The wording of that message is the same as what God had told Moses earlier in that chapter. That's instructive. See, the messenger doesn't change the message. God tells Moses that when he goes to the elders with this news, that they will listen to him. And then he and the elders are to go together to Pharaoh and say that their God has met with them, and they should request that Pharaoh allow them to go on a 3-day journey into the wilderness so they can sacrifice to their God. Question: why would they tell Pharaoh that they only want to go on a 3-day retreat when God told Moses that this was going to be a permanent relocation into Canaan? It's kind of fun reading what all the commentators speculate about this. The suggestion that made the most sense to me was that this statement was intended to be just the opening line of a negotiation governed by the custom of bartering. It was showing respect to a man whose heart was hardened to any kind of negotiation at all. In fact, God tells Moses at the end of chapter 3 that Pharaoh will not let them go unless he's compelled by a mighty hand. It's okay. God will stretch out his mighty hand and strike Egypt with signs and wonders that will compel him to let them go. God knows exactly what the future holds, and he is not going to be surprised by Pharaoh's reaction. In fact, one thing we're going to see as we go through this book is that several times God takes responsibility for causing Pharaoh's hard heart. And it alternates with verses that say that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. I think that'd make a good question to ask a guest theologian. Well, not only is Pharaoh going to let the people go eventually, but God said he would give the Hebrews favor in the eyes of the Egyptians so that before they left, every Hebrew woman would be able to go to her Egyptian neighbor and ask for silver and gold jewelry and clothing, and they would give it up. One commentator suggests that the Hebrews could have considered that their plunder payment for their years in bondage. But no matter how they looked at it, the Hebrews would not be leaving Egypt with empty pockets. God's people would have something to show for their years in captivity because God gave them favor. He loved them. He doesn't love his children any less today. This ties in with what we were saying before the break, that time spent in captivity, or even time spent in God's woodshed of discipline, is not time spent in vain. God is always working something good in those who belong to him. I can't say that with any authority or certainty that he works that way with those who don't belong to them. I don't know what purpose their misery serves. But in addition to working holiness and righteousness into the hearts of his children through discipline, God also gives us gifts, spiritual gifts which are glorious and which help build up the body of Christ. I don't understand why so many Christians seem to want to trade their spiritual gifts in exchange for material blessings. Spiritual gifts are often treated like that Christmas present from your grandmother that's totally not cool. We'd take it back to the store and get the money and shop somewhere else altogether. Scripturology might have a lot more viewers if I told you that God wants you to have material blessings. But I can't do that with any kind of scriptural integrity. We don't take verses out of context and treat them like promises from a fortune cookie. That's the way the prosperity gospel is taught. We'll pay attention to the example of how God deals with his servant Moses and how he deals with his people, the Egyptians, as we continue our study of Exodus. I hope that you'll join me next week as we pick up with chapters 4 and 5 of the book of Exodus. We'll see you next week on Scripturology.